Señor Presidente de la Academia Colombiana de Ciencias Exactas, Físicas y Naturales y miembros de la Academia, distinguidos integrantes de la comunidad universitaria, distinguidos conferencistas, señoras y señores participantes en este evento. Es un placer darles la bienvenida a la Conferencia Internacional Colombia en el Año Internacional de la Luz 2015. Gracias a los conferencistas y a los asistentes a este evento, que es de especial interés e importancia para nuestro país. Permítanme presentarles a ustedes un esbozo de la historia educativa y profesional del profesor Alain Aspect, destacado científico francés, y describir brevemente uno de los temas de investigación en el que se ha ganado un amplio reconocimiento internacional. El doctor Aspect se encuentra vinculado al Instituto de Óptica, Escuela de Graduados en Palaiseau, ubicado a unos 17 kilómetros del centro de París, donde se forman ingenieros a nivel de maestría y doctorado. Ocupa la posición de profesor Agustín Fresnel, es profesor de tiempo parcial en la Escuela Politécnica y es profesor distinguido del Centro Nacional de Investigación Científica, CNRS. Su tesis de maestría la hizo entre 1969 y 1971 sobre espectroscopía de Fourier por holografía. Su tesis de doctorado entre 1974 y 1983, donde culminó con el trabajo titulado Tres pruebas experimentales de las desigualdades de Bell con fotones enredados. El profesor Aspect ha sido objeto de más de 20 importantes distinciones entre 1983 y 2014. A modo de ejemplo, menciono las más recientes, otorgadas por sus experimentos sobre las pruebas de las desigualdades de Bell. En el 2012, la medalla Albert Einstein. En el 2013, 3 distinciones, a saber, la medalla de oro internacional Niels Bohr, el premio Balzan y la medalla UNESCO Niels Bohr. El número de artículos en revistas internacionales con autoría o coautoría del doctor Aspect supera los 200, de los cuales más de 20 han sido citados más de 100 veces, según estadísticas del Instituto de Información Científica Web of Science. Permítanme ahora comentarles brevemente sobre los comienzos de su brillante carrera, en la que el doctor Aspect se ha convertido en un destacado científico y un ejemplo para la juventud. La historia de la física incluye un gran debate que comenzó con un artículo de Albert Einstein, Boris Podolsky y Nathan Rosen, publicado en 1935, titulado ¿Se puede considerar que la descripción mecánico-cuántica de la realidad física es completa? Las iniciales de los autores han dado lugar a la sigla EPR, de amplia presencia en la literatura de las ciencias físicas. En un sistema compuesto por 2 o más subsistemas, un estado mecánico cuántico es separable si se puede expresar como un producto de estados puros de los subsistemas individuales. Pero existen estados sin análogo clásico, para los que la función de onda no se puede expresar en forma de producto. Schrödinger se refirió a ellos en 1935 como estados entangled o estados entrelazados. Einstein, Podolsky y Rosen construyen su argumentación sobre los criterios de realidad física, localidad y libre albedrío del experimentador, para concluir que la mecánica cuántica no podía ser una teoría completa y que debería ser complementada con variables adicionales que dieran cuenta del carácter probabilístico de la teoría cuántica. Dentro de la comunidad de físicos surge entonces la idea de completar la teoría cuántica con variables adicionales que recibieron el nombre de variables ocultas, que tenían el propósito de restaurar la completitud de la teoría. Pero siempre hay un contradictor. El contradictor de la conclusión EPR fue Niels Bohr, Premio Nobel de 1922, quien en el mismo año dio una respuesta que se fundamenta en el papel de los instrumentos de medición en la constitución de los fenómenos cuánticos. A la expresión realidad física no se puede asignar un significado deducido de concepciones filosóficas a priori. En contraste con la mecánica ordinaria, la nueva mecánica no es una descripción espacio-tiempo del movimiento de partículas atómicas. La mecánica cuántica es una teoría no local, completa de la naturaleza, y la medición tiene un carácter probabilístico fundamental. Después de la respuesta de Bohr, el debate EPR se desvaneció lentamente. Las discusiones sobre las variables ocultas tuvieron en esencia un carácter metafísico, ya que la argumentación EPR no tenía consecuencias que se pudieran observar o medir en el laboratorio. Después de un lapso de unos 29 años, en 1964, todo comienza de nuevo con John Bell. En su trabajo titulado Sobre la paradoja de Einstein, Podolsky y Rosen, Bell adopta como hipótesis de trabajo los argumentos EPR sobre la existencia de una teoría local de variables ocultas capaz de reproducir los resultados de la mecánica cuántica, y de ella deduce sus consecuencias. Para que las variables ocultas restauren la física determinista, se requiere el cumplimiento de unas desigualdades, cuya violación confirmaría la mecánica cuántica. Alain Aspect, un joven, leyó el artículo de Bell y relata que quedó fascinado con su lectura, por lo que decidió hacer su tesis de estado, su doctorado, realizando un experimento en el que se pudiesen hacer ajustes durante el vuelo de las partículas, como Bell lo sugería en su artículo. En 1975, acogiendo una sugerencia de su director de tesis de doctorado, acordó una cita con John Bell y fue al CERN en Ginebra a discutir la propuesta de experimento. Después de escuchar al joven Aspect, Bell comenzó a hablar de física y definitivamente lo animó a realizar el experimento, dejando claro que era importante un mejoramiento en la implementación de los analizadores. Pero en el transcurso de la conversación expresó: Aspect, la mecánica cuántica ha sido reivindicada por una gran cantidad de trabajos de físicos, teóricos y experimentales muy inteligentes. Con un esquema tan simple, ¿cómo espera encontrar alguna cosa nueva en la óptica, una ciencia del siglo XIX? En ese momento, Aspect tomó conciencia de que en adición al experimento tenía que desarrollar una teoría argumentativa para tratar de convencer a los físicos y conseguir recursos para el proyecto. Parece que lo logró, pues años después, en 1981 y 1982, publicó 3 artículos que forman parte de los experimentos sobresalientes de la física y que fueron seleccionados en Physical Review Letters como los hitos de 1981. Comillas, en estos artículos, Aspect y colaboradores sometieron a prueba experimental el comportamiento espacio-temporal de un sistema entrelazado. Desde los famosos experimentos sobre las desigualdades de Bell de los años 81 y 82, el profesor Aspect ha explorado múltiples temas de la física. Hoy va a presentar a ustedes el tema titulado El efecto atómico Hahn-Mandel, una nueva evidencia del entrelazamiento atómico. El efecto lleva el nombre de los 3 físicos de la Universidad de Rochester que lo demostraron por primera vez en 1987 con 2 fotones. Se envían de manera simultánea a 2 fotones a través de 2 puertos de entrada de un divisor de A 50%, 50%. Cada puerto de salida tiene un detector. Sorprendentemente, cuando los fotones son idénticos, no hay clics simultáneos en ambos puertos de salida. Es decir, los fotones han interferido destructivamente. Por el contrario, la probabilidad de detección aumenta entre más distinguibles sean los fotones entre sí. Desde 1987, este efecto ha sido objeto de múltiples investigaciones y, en opinión del profesor Aspect, el efecto abre el camino para someter a prueba las desigualdades de Bell con observables mecánicos de partículas masivas. Para concluir, en este breve relato, asociado con la historia de la física, nos remontamos con nuestra mente al año 1935, 12 años antes del nacimiento de nuestro conferencista. Por cierto, ayer 15 de junio, el profesor Aspect celebró su cumpleaños número 68. Con este motivo, y por el estímulo que su visita le da a la ciencia en Colombia, le sugiero respetuosamente a la audiencia recibirlo con un fuerte aplauso.
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Es un honor y un placer estar aquí. Es mi primera visita a Colombia y me encanta la amabilidad de los colombianos. Ahora cambio a inglés. Yes, I'm really happy to be here to celebrate the International Year of Flight in Colombia. And I am not going to make so long thanks to everybody, but I want to thank Enrique Forero and all the scientists here in Bogota and in Medellin who have organized this wonderful event. I want also to thank the French embassy, who plays an important role for allowing us to be here. And I want to take it as a sign that there are strong relations between Colombia and France, and that the French embassy is really helping these relations. And so I hope that after this visit there will be yet more connections. For instance, my institution, the Institut d'Optique, is one of the best engineering in optics institution in the world, I think, with fields spanning from the most basic optics, quantum optics, to the most applied optics in lasers and ultraviolet and X-ray mirrors, nanophotonics, things like that. And I hope that we will be able to develop more relations. So today I'm going to talk about a subject in quantum optics, the Angot and Mendel effect. And I'm happy to see in the program that quantum optics in Colombia is developing, and I'm glad that this visit will be an opportunity to meet colleagues and discuss about possibility of making more exchanges. You know that quantum optics is very important because it's a part of the rapidly developing field of quantum information. And so quantum optics has also been a very important subject for understanding and even testing the most fundamental aspects of quantum mechanics. And one of them is entanglement, and the Angot and Mendel effect was a wonderful way of giving experimental evidence of entanglement. The experiment of Angot and Mendel was about 30 years ago, but now with the fantastic progress of the control of atoms, the cold atom physics, it becomes possible to revisit landmarks in quantum optics using atoms rather than photons, and this is what I will present today. So I think it's time to start the conference itself. So first, a little more of advertisement. This is a group of Atom Optics in Institut Optique, and we are working on quantum simulation experiments, a subject on which Anna Maria is going to talk, but we are doing it experimentally, although we have also a theory team. And we have also a line of research which is quantum atom optics, and this will be my subject today. And these are the people who have done the experiment I am going to present today, and the most important, of course, is the main PhD student who did this PhD on the subject. And just as an idea to invite people to come, he came from Portugal to do the PhD in our group, and he was a fantastic student, and now he has a bright career in front of him, opening in front of him. So maybe it can give ideas to students here. Okay, let us start with quantum mechanics and what Feynman called the quantum mysteries of quantum mechanics. According to Feynman, there are two big mysteries in quantum mechanics. The first one, he elaborated in the famous book, Lectures on Physics, and it's about wave-particle duality, the fact that a single particle can interfere with itself. And so you know that a particle, for instance an electron, also behaves as a wave, and vice versa, waves, such as light, can also behave as particles. So the big surprise is that the same object can have the two behaviors. But anyway, if you think about it, you see that I am still using classical words, classical concepts, waves or particle, which develop in which evolve in ordinary space, okay? So the mystery is the fact that the same object can have the two behaviors, but these behaviors can still be described classically. The second big mystery is entanglement. And it's only 20 years later that Feynman emphasized the fact that entanglement is yet more intriguing and surprising. And in this paper, where he introduced the notion of quantum computing, he insisted on the strange character of entanglement. Why is it strange? Because entanglement can be revealed by interference in Hilbert space, but interference between two photons or two atoms or two electron amplitudes, and there is no way to describe this as something happening in our ordinary space. You have really to be in this abstract Hilbert space. So in contrast to this, there is no classical model in ordinary space-time to render an account of the effect of entanglement. And this is why it's really going beyond the first quantum mystery. And to finish with this introduction, I want to emphasize that probably we are living a new quantum revolution. And this new quantum revolution is based on two basic ingredients. First, recognizing that entanglement is really a revolutionary concept, as guessed by Einstein and Bohr, as we heard recently, and also strikingly demonstrated by Bell's inequality, and put to use by Feynman et others, who say, okay, let us use entanglement for quantum computing. But a second, as important ingredient in the new quantum revolution is the fact that, in contrast to what we did previously, that is to say having the zillions of photons in a laser beam or zillions of electrons in a transistor or something like that, now we are working with individual quantum objects. So you know we can manipulate individual atoms, we can observe individual atoms, and we can emit single photons, single photon pairs, we can manipulate, we can have single ions, and we can, well, this is Serge talk, we can have manipulate individual photons, okay? So remember that the new quantum revolution is entanglement plus the ability to isolate, control, and manipulate individual quantum objects. And with this in mind, let us switch to the Hong, Wu, and Mandel effect, and a little bit of tutoring about the Hong, Wu, and Mandel effect with photon. This was the experiment as it was published in 1987, and it looks complicated, but actually the scheme is just. Can I have a microphone to move? I feel uncomfortable. You can give me the. So this apparently complicated scheme actually is nothing else than that. Here you produce pairs of photons isolated with small pinholes, and then you recombine them on a beam splitter. And what they did by moving, for instance, this mirror, they can change the delay between the arrival of the first photon and the second photon of the beam splitter. And they look at the probability of a joint detection on the two detectors on both outputs of the beam splitter. And what they find is that when the two photons arrive exactly simultaneously on the beam splitter, then the probability of joint detection drops to almost zero. In other words, if the photons do not arrive simultaneously on the detector, you have a certain probability to detect one here and the other one there. But if they arrive exactly at the same moment, then this probability goes to zero. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Initially, when you read this paper, you find that this experiment was designed to measure with a femtosecond accuracy this ability and in a sense, the width of the wave packet of each photon, because by looking at the width of this curve here, you can measure the width of the wave packet of the photons. And the reason why they could measure it with femtosecond accuracy, although there is absolutely no detector with such an accuracy, is that by moving a mirror only by 1 micron, when you move a mirror by 1 micrometer, then it amounts to changing the delay by only 3 femtoseconds. So they were very proud of that. And then sometime later, a few months later, they came with the realization that this is an unbelievably intriguing quantum effect. And to make a long story short, the effect can be explained in the following way. If you look at the pair of photons emitted here, arriving on the beam splitter and being detected here and there, actually there are two possibilities. The upper photon is reflected and detected up, and the lower photon is reflected and detected down. But there is another possibility. The upper photon is transmitted and detected down, and the lower photon is transmitted and detected up. We have the same process from the same initial state and same final state, and so we know from our elementary course in quantum mechanics that when we cannot distinguish between two paths from an initial state to a final state, we must add the amplitude. So we have to add the amplitude of this process and that process.
Then there is a technical point that usually students think just a detail, but which is not at all a detail. When you look at the reflection on beam splitter from one side and the reflection from the other side, there is an extra pi factor, out of phase factor. And this factor is not a small technical detail. It's related to the unitarity of the beam splitter, the fact that the beam splitter is a perfect beam splitter. And because of this pi factor between the two schemes, there is a minus sign, which means that when you add this amplitude and amplitude, in fact, the two numbers have opposite signs, as the result is 0. This is a basic interpretation of the Hong-Wang-Mandel effect, and you see that this involves amplitudes which involve the two photons. You cannot describe it in ordinary space. You have to describe it only by considering the amplitude of the two photons. So it is a spectacular evidence of entanglement. In my introduction, that the reason why it is so spectacular is that there is absolutely no model classically looking that you could describe in ordinary space to describe such an effect. No model with classical particles, no model with classical waves, and I'm going to spend a few minutes to show you that, because it allows us how intriguing it is. Let us first try to analyze this experiment, assuming that we have something like classical particles. So we have a classical particle arriving here with 50% chance to be reflected, 50% chance to be transmitted. Same for that particle, 50% chance to be transmitted, 50% chance to be reflected. Now, what can we have? The particles they are classical, they are independent. So what can we have? We can have two particles on one side, two particles on the other side. We can have particle 1 detected here and particle 2 detected there, and the reverse. So actually there are 4 possibilities, one for the two particles here, one for the two particles here, and 2 possibilities for one here and there, which means that the probability we calculate to have a joint detection here is 50%. So absolutely no dip, absolutely no lack of detection on both sides of the beam splitter. If we take now classical waves, so we have a wave packet here and another wave packet here, and we try to understand what happens. If the beam splitter is a 50% beam splitter, the probability of single detection here in the semi-classical model, that is to say the model in which light is not quantized, but anyway matter is quantized and we have the photoelectric effect and everything. So the probability to have single detection here is proportional to 1/2 of the intensity from here and the intensity from there. Same for the other single detection. And now, if we look at the rate of joint detection, it's just the product of these two single detection, so nothing special, no dip. But you can tell me, look, maybe if the wave packets are fluctuating, maybe there is a way to mimic the Hong-Wang-Mandel dip. Not at all. Because if you calculate now what happens if you average over many different and fluctuating wave packets, you find that the probability of joint detection is no longer equal, it's bigger than that. So it's not a dip, it's a bump. So if you want to understand why it is bigger, maybe it's better to rewrite this equation by replacing the square modulus of the electric field, of the complex electric field, by intensity. If we do that, single detection is proportional to intensity. Now, when I average, the average of single detection is proportional to the average of intensity, but the rate of joint detection is proportional to the average of the square. And I hope you all know, this is a kind of Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, that the average of the square is always bigger than the square of the average. And so not only there is no dip, but you rather expect a bump. So this model cannot work. Now let us try a more sophisticated model. A model in which the wave arriving here and the wave arriving there are mutually coherent. Now something interesting will happen. So you see the wave in the second input is the same as a wave in the first input, plus a phase factor. And if you calculate the interference here, you have an interesting result. The probability to detect here goes as a square of the cosine of this factor. The probability of detection here goes as a square of the sine, which means that, for instance, if you make phi equals 0, all the detection happen here and no detection there. So probability of joint detection is obviously 0. The rate of joint detection is proportional to this product, and I hope that students in Columbia know that cosine phi times sine phi can be expressed as a function of psi of 2 phi, okay? I'm not sure that French students today know that, but okay, we'll see. So you have the rate of joint detection proportional to that. Now, of course, if you want to mimic the Hongou and Mandel experiment, you cannot have phi fixed because in the experiment, obviously, there is a randomness. Sometimes you detect here, you detect there, so you need to have randomness. So you take phi as a random variable and you take the average. And when you take the average, now it is interesting because you have indeed a dip. So maybe you can mimic the Hongou and Mandel effect with a classical model. But look, the dip is here as a visibility of only 1/2, and in the experiment it was going to 0. So maybe you can say, aha, but if I have now fluctuation about this, what happens? What happens is again the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, which tells you that taking into account all the possible fluctuation, the dip cannot be less than 1/2, and usually it should be more than 1/2 if you would try to explain the Hongou and Mandel effect with a classical model. So the conclusion is that indeed there is no classical description, no classical particles, no classical waves. Classical waves cannot predict a dip below 50%. Okay, with this in mind, let us now revisit this experiment, not with photons, but with atoms. So years ago, in our group, in Institut d'Optique, we embarked into revisiting quantum optics with metastable helium atom. Why is metastable helium atom so useful, so nice for revisiting quantum optics? For the following reason. You all know that helium atom has 2 electrons, and these 2 electrons can be either parallel or antiparallel. When they are parallel, we say that the atoms are in the triplet state, and when they are antiparallel, they are in the singlet state. And basically, there is absolutely no communication between the set of triplet levels and the set of singlet levels. What I mean by no communication, I mean by absorbing or emitting light, the atom cannot go from a state which is a triplet to a state which is a singlet. Which means that here I have drawn the various levels. If I put the atom in any of the triplet set of levels, it will only evolve in this set, and the lowest state of the triplet state is here. It's separated from the first excited triplet level by 1.08 micron, and this is a convenient laser wavelength, so we can manipulate this assuming that this is a ground state. And we can do all the usual tricks of laser cooling and trapping, etc., using this transition and taking this atom with an effective ground state, which is here. But in fact, it is not the real ground state. The real ground state is a singlet state, the lowest state with the 2 electron antiparallel. And this state is 20 electron volts below that state. What happens is that if such an atom approaches a piece of matter, because of the, let's say, electrostatic or electromagnetic interaction, van der Waals force or this kind of force between matter and the atom, then this interaction can flip one of the 2 electrons of the atom, and now you have a singlet state, and the atom can fall in that state. So to make a long story short, when the atom comes very close to the piece of matter, 20 electron volts of energy are released. And this is much than enough to ionize anything. So In fact, what you can do, when such an atom drops on a piece of metal, it produces the extraction of a single electron. Does this ring a bell in your mind? Photoelectric effect? When a single photon arrives on a photocathode, one electron is emitted. Here the same thing. When a single metastable helium atom arrives on a piece of metal, one electron is emitted, and then you can amplify it with an electron multiplier and detect atom by atom. Okay. So this is an artist's view of a kind of experiment we do. We have magnetic fields to trap the atoms. Here I have a cloud of atoms, and when a metastable helium atom drops and arrives on a piece of metal, which is here, then there is an electron emitted. In fact, this is not an ordinary piece of metal. This is what is called a microchannel plate detector, which is millions, billions even, billions of small electron multipliers. So when the atom arrives here, on the back of this plate, you get an electric pulse, which is large enough that you can detect it with electronics, okay? So this looks like a photomultiplier, which can detect individual photons. In fact, it's yet better, because we have modified the system in the following way. Below the microchannel plate detector, we introduce delay lines, so when an atom arrives here, you have an electric pulse here, and then the electric pulse is split in various parts, and by looking at the time to go at the end of the delay lines, you can tell where the atom arrives. So it's not only a single particle detector, but it is a position-resolved single atom detector. And it's also time-resolved with a resolution of the order of a nanosecond. So now we have a system which is very nice. The resolution is not as good as we were expecting. We were expecting, when we designed the system, 20 micrometer resolution. We got 200 micrometer. Should we be unhappy? Not so much. If you think that the size of the system is many centimeters, actually it's just like having 10 to the 7th independent detectors able to tell us where and when the atom arrives. This was a dream in optics, and the dream is realized with metastable atoms. So we have many single atom detectors working in parallel. So just for people who know what it is, with this wonderful detector, we revisited probably the first important quantum optics experiment, the Hamburg-Brown and Twiss effect. And to make a long story short, it was the realization that when you have thermal light and you look at the probability to detect two photons close to each other, this probability is bigger than if you try to detect them far from each other. This can be understood classically, but if you insist on understanding it quantum mechanically, then you find entanglement. And actually, it is for understanding this experiment that Roy Glauber developed in the early 60s the whole formalism of quantum optics, which was there available for us to do other understanding in quantum optics. So the experiment is the following. You have a cloud of cold atoms, cold but not Bose-Einstein condensation, okay? Cold atoms. You drop them on the detector, and each time an atom arrives on the detector, you note its position and the time of detection. And because you know the velocity of the atom, actually what you can reconstruct is the whole distribution of the atom in the cloud. And then you look at the probability to have two atoms at a certain distance. And what you find is that the probability is bigger for a smaller distance. This can be understood as the fact that bosonic atoms like, between quotes, to be on top of each other. What happens with fermions? We could do the experiment by switching from helium-4, which is a boson, to helium-3, which is a fermion, and then what you find is that two fermionic atoms do not like at all to be on top of each other. This is a direct demonstration of the Pauli principle, but when you write the equation, it's again an interference between two particle amplitudes, here with a positive sign and here with a negative sign. This shows that this detector is beautiful for looking at quantum optics effects. So let us now proceed. As my colleagues in quantum optics here know, a breakthrough in quantum optics was the production of pairs of photons by a nonlinear effect, parametric down conversion. So we looked for the possibility to produce atom pairs and not photon pairs by a similar effect, and the idea is the following. You take two Bose-Einstein condensates and you collide them against each other. And when the Bose-Einstein condensate is dense enough, there is an interaction energy, and this interaction energy can be described as a nonlinear effect for matter waves, a Chi3. Chi3, a third order nonlinear effect, which means that you can think of mixing two waves and getting two output waves. It's called four-wave mixing. So this kind of experiment was first introduced in the early 2000s, and we could observe it beautifully again with our system. We collide the two Bose-Einstein condensate, and we let everything fall. And then we look at the distribution of velocity. How can we look on the distribution of velocity? Our Bose-Einstein condensates are small, but after a long time of fall, you have a big cloud, and so if you register the position in the cloud, it is a reflect of the initial velocity of the atoms. Okay, so this is what we observe. Let me show it here. This is a full distribution of the velocity, and you see like a shell. This shell corresponds to the fact that when you collide the two Bose-Einstein condensates, you get atom with velocity p with momentum p in all directions of space, okay? And here, the big patch here is the fact that we have collided the two Bose-Einstein condensates, and they have continued, okay? It's only a small fraction of them which have given this diffracted or diffused particles. So now we think that we can produce an atom and the opposite atom. How can we know that? We can know that. Do we really have atom pairs? For that, you know, the beauty of this experiment is that once you have registered all the position of the atom at the end of the time of flight, you have plenty of time for processing the data. And for instance, you can look at the probability to have an atom here and an atom exactly opposite in velocity. And what you find is that, yes, there is a sharp peak corresponding to the correlation in opposite direction. So indeed, we have been able to produce pairs of atoms. So now we have pairs of atoms, and we can think of doing the Nguyen-Mendel experiment, which demands pairs. But there is something which is annoying with this scheme. And what is annoying is that the pairs are produced in all directions of space, and this is not good. The beauty of parametric down conversion in nonlinear optics is the fact that the photons are produced in well-defined direction. So we were dreaming of having atoms, pairs, with atoms produced in well-defined direction. And there was an idea by Mulmer and his collaborator 10 years ago, and demonstrated in the lab of Wolfgang Ketterle. And the idea is the following. It's a little bit involved, so only people who know the subject probably will follow the detail. But the idea is the following. If you have atoms which are allowed to circulate only along one direction by using what is called only 14 minutes? Well, that's okay. Yes. I check, you know, I have an atomic clock on my computer, so I can check. That's fine, thank you very much. So you force the atom to circulate along one direction by having a laser beam, an optical tweezer, okay? Now we have a one-dimensional problem. You superimpose onto this direction a light a standing light wave which imposes a periodic potential on the atoms. And now you have a problem of a particle circulating in a periodic potential. And if you have studied solid-state physics, you know that there is all this scheme with Bloch waves, etc. And finally, you have a dispersion relation, that is to say, value of the energy as a function of the k vector, which has this strange shape. And it turns out that if you start, for instance, with a Bose-Einstein condensate with a certain momentum here, it can spontaneously, so to speak, give rise to one atom with this velocity and one atom with that velocity. And now you see that the scheme is beautiful because we impose the direction of the two members of the pair, and moreover, not only we impose the direction, but we also impose a value of the k vector, that is to say, we impose a value of the velocity. So now we know how to produce pairs with a well-defined direction and a well-defined value of the velocity. So with this in hand, so we published this result showing that yes, indeed, we have pairs and we can master the velocity. With this in hand, we started the Angevin-Mandel effect with atoms. For this experiment, everything is vertical, okay? So we force the atom to circulate vertically. So we start with our Bose-Einstein condensate, which is trapped, and we impose the moving lattice, because rather than moving the atom in the lattice, it turns out to be more convenient to move the lattice. And with this process, we produce a pairs of atoms. After, this is a detail for colleagues who understand the details, after pair production, the atoms which are in the m=1 Zeeman sublevel are transferred into m=0. Why? Because magnetic fields are always difficult to avoid. And in m=0, the atoms are no longer sensitive to magnetic field, so we can fight decoherence by putting them in m=0 field. Now, we have created our pair, and everything is falling. Is it a problem that everything is falling? No, because we are going to put ourselves in the falling frame of reference, and we are going to wait. We have a few tenths of milliseconds to operate, and then we will do our business. So what is our business? While the atoms are falling, or actually they are not falling, we launch them up. So we have the two atoms of the pair with different initial velocity, and they will go for parabola like that, or not parabola having time here and position here. But then we will follow everything in the frame of reference, which is the average, the center of gravity of the two atoms, okay? Now, in this frame of reference, we will apply mirrors for atoms. How do we apply mirrors for atoms? Again, light. You know, everything uses light. I work with atoms, but light is a basic tool for everything. So now we are going to impose a grating which is exactly adjusted to provoke a Bragg reflection of the atom going up downwards, or a Bragg reflection of the atom going like that upwards. If I go into the falling frame of reference, this is how it shows. The atom starts up, then Bragg reflection goes down. This atom goes down, Bragg reflection goes up. After a certain time, we will apply again the standing wave of light, and now we apply it for half the duration. So rather than reflecting totally the atoms, we only reflect them partially. This is a beam splitter. And then the atom continue to fall. And then I need to have the two detectors. Do I need to have fully detectors? Not at all. Because at the end, the atom arrive on the beautiful detector, which is here, and I just look at the time and position when they arrive, and I process everything. And so we can process everything, okay, let us go. And then after looking at all the data, what we get is the probability to get the two atoms in two channels exactly image of each other as a function of the delay between the arrival of the atoms on the beam splitter. How do we change the delay? We change the delay by changing the timing between the various mirrors here, okay? And this is a beautiful Hong-Ouen-Mandel deep, and this Hong-Ouen-Mandel deep has a visibility larger than 50%, so there is no way to interpret it, even with, between quote, classical matter waves. Even de Broglie waves cannot render an account of this experiment. If you want to understand this experiment, you have to think of the interference between the amplitudes describing the two atoms simultaneously. So, summary and outlook to make our chairwoman happy. But the summary will be a little long. So what have we found? An unambiguous observation of an interference of two atom amplitudes in the Hong-Ouen-Mandel scheme. Because the deep is below 50%, the visibility is larger than 50%, no wave interpretation possible. Well, this is a technical detail. If you want to ask question, you can comment. It's one of the few demonstrations of two atom amplitude interference I can cite. First, the atomic Hanbury-Briand twist effect that I described rapidly, which was also seen in Amsterdam and in Canberra. Beautiful recent experiment in Boulder, which is the so-called two-atom Rabi oscillation in tunnel couple optical tweezer. Again, an experiment which can be understood only by invoking two-atom amplitude interference. And there is a full host of condensed matter experiments, but I must admit that these experiments are very difficult for me to understand, so I will not try to explain them. But I trust the people, it's effects of the same kind. Now, what next? Well, our project is a yet stronger evidence of entanglement. And what is this yet stronger evidence of entanglement? Bell's inequality test. If you look at the history of quantum optics, okay, or optics, let's say, you find that the important milestones beyond, of course, interference in the 19th century, Young and Fresnel, but the production of single photons with the first experiment by Clauser in '74, and then the experiment we did with my student Philippe Granger in '85, and then Mandel and everybody did a lot of experiment. Photon correlation in the Hanbury-Briand twist experiment in the '55, then the first production of photon pairs by parametric down conversion, then experiment on squeezing. Bell inequality tests were done with photon produced in radiative cascade. First experiment by Clauser, then the experiment we did in Institut Optique in the early '80s. And then Hong-Ouen-Mandel effect with pairs of photon produced in Chi2 photon pairs. And finally, eventually, in the late '90s, Bell's inequality test with such pairs. So where are we with atoms? We have shown atom correlation of the kind of Hanbury-Briand twist. We have shown squeezing. We have shown the production of pairs of atoms by a nonlinear effect. It's Chi3 rather than Chi2, but this is technical, it's unimportant. We have demonstrated the Hong-Ouen-Mandel effect with such pairs, and then we are ready for the next step, because testing Bell's inequality is a yet more stronger evidence of entanglement than the previous one. So how will we do it? We think that we have schemes, the same schemes that I have described. We can produce not only atoms in a state where you have an atom with momentum P3 and the opposite momentum P4 equals minus P3, but we think that we can make such a state, which is a highly entangled state, which is the superposition of P3, P4, and P'3, P'4. And if we can do that, reflect the atoms, and we have shown that we can do it with the Bragg reflection, then use beam splitter here and there, and then have 4 detectors, but as you know, this is not a problem. We have millions of detectors. If we look at the correlation between these as a function of the position of the mirrors that we can master with a laser, maybe we can test Bell's inequality. What would be new in this test of Bell's inequality compared to all the wonderful tests of Bell's inequality with photons or with ions or something like that? It would be the first test of Bell's inequality with mechanical observable, I mean momentum, of massive particles. Maybe, and here I have to be careful because the real specialist is Bill Unruh, who is here. Maybe such an experiment touches the frontier between quantum mechanics and gravity. Who knows? I will be happy to have this wonderful opportunity to meet him. It will be my first meeting with Bill Unruh, so I have to thank the Columbia Academy of Science to offer this possibility. With this, I think it's time to close. So it's the end, and the only thing I have to show again is a photo of the people who have done the experiment. Thank you very much.